You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
We are continuing to record from quarantine. We hope everybody's doing well out there.
We can see each other, but we're hundreds of miles apart, quarantined in separate locations.
We are recording live from quarantine. Bill, how's quarantine going for you guys up in Connecticut?
It's going well. Should I say I'm in an undisclosed location in a bunker somewhere?
I think that would make it sound a little more glamorous.
Well, I don't know how glamorous a bunker would be, but no, I'm happy to be here in the library, our beautiful house. If we had to be stuck somewhere, I'm good with where we are.
And I'm pretty good with where I am too. It's a nice sunny day here in Williamsburg. It's about 75 degrees maybe. I know you guys had snow the other day, so I think it's a lot nicer here than it is where you are.
I think we're done with the snow. We've been out working in the garden a little bit, and we're just determined to push past the idea that it would snow again.
Well, let's hope it doesn't. You know, where we were supposed to be this time at the end of this week.
I do remember.
We were supposed to be at CrimeCon at the end of this week.
Yes, indeed.
And we are certainly bummed that we are not able to be in sunny. I hope it's sunny in Orlando. I think it's sunny in Orlando.
It should be.
Yeah, we're bummed that we cannot be in sunny Orlando for CrimeCon, but we are looking forward to CrimeCon being rescheduled for Halloween. That's going to be super awesome, I think.
Yes, indeed. This is assuming they're going to let thousands of people meet in a hotel conference room safely, but I guess we'll wait and see what happens this fall.
Yeah, I guess we'll see how the Rona ends up treating the rest of us here.
Now you sound like your high school students.
Yeah. And they rub off after a while,
I was thinking the same thing.
They do. I'm stuck somewhere in the world between being an adult and being a high school student.
Gives you that youthful vibe that makes you so interesting.
Well, we wanted to get back to covering cases. We've had some excellent guest appearances the last couple of weeks, and we've really enjoyed having Jim Fitzgerald, for example, come and speak with us. But we did want to get back to what we know and love, which is discussing various cases with all of you. So we have the case today of the Canal Killer from Phoenix, Arizona, which is a case that I had heard about when I lived in Phoenix. I lived there for about 5 years, from 2005 to 2010. The case had not happened during that time period. The case actually happened in 1992 and 1993, but I had heard about the Canal Killer. I have always found the case very interesting. And when an arrest was made in 2015, and all of my Phoenix friends were like, "Did you hear the Canal Killer was arrested?" I knew it was a case I wanted to keep up with. So we thought it would be interesting to venture away from Virginia for a little bit. Never fear, we'll be back, and cover a case from the various places where we have lived and worked. So we decided to cover a Phoenix case. And we want to make clear up top that the Canal Killer, his name is Brian Patrick Miller, has not yet been prosecuted for, convicted of the murders that have been tentatively attributed to him. This case is still in litigation. In fact, the trial has been scheduled and rescheduled and rescheduled a number of times now since his arrest in 2015. Allegedly, the trial will be actually happening in June of 2020. So I guess we'll see what happens in the next month or two. But we want to make sure that we establish up front that Brian Patrick Miller has not been convicted of these crimes in a court of law yet.
So if we forget, remember, we should be saying alleged perpetrator, potential perpetrator, suspect, and we really mean that. This man has not been convicted of these crimes. Certainly, allegations have been made and charges have been brought. Whether or not this trial actually happens in June 2020, like most other things like CrimeCon, and any gathering that involves people being in the same physical space, etc., whether this trial actually takes place in June 2020 remains to be seen.
So there are 2 known victims of the perpetrator known as the Canal Killer, who may or may not, as we mentioned, be Brian Patrick Miller. So I'm going to jump right in and talk about both of the known victims. The first murder took place, in November of 1992. And that is the murder of Angela Brasso, or Brasso, possibly I'm saying that wrong, but we're going to go with Brasso, I think. 22 years old. She was known as Angie and was a recent transplant to Phoenix. She was originally from Pennsylvania and was described by family and friends as being happy-go-lucky and fearless, the sort of person who you knew was in a room immediately and who would sort of light up the room when she arrived in it. Angie was described as an animal lover who spent every spare cent that she had apparently on guinea pigs and bunnies, which for the record, I think are excellent things to spend your money on.
I think so too. As a former rabbit owner and current dog owner.
Oh, you had bunnies? That's wonderful.
We had a bunny, Robert Maxwell Rabbit, Esquire. All of our pets had these very elaborate names. My dad named all the pets, which is probably where we get Oliver Wendell Weiner, Esquire, our current long-haired dachshund.
Oh, good. I wasn't sure if Oliver was an Esquire or not. That's fabulous.
Oh, absolutely. Being named for a Supreme Court Justice, Oliver Wendell Holmes, he absolutely is an Esquire.
He would have to be. Well, that's excellent.
Yeah, and Robert Maxwell Rabbit was also Esquire. You'd have to ask my dad where these names come from. Everything around our house had elaborate names.
That is fantastic. I love it. That's great. So there's some Bill Thomas trivia for all of you cool cats and kittens out there.
Sure. Our Christmas tree was named Grover one year, and then it had a root ball, and so when we planted it outside, and Grover grew to be a mighty tree. There were 3 bushes that my parents put outside the back door when they were doing renovations, and they were named Faye, Marge, and Joan. And we asked my parents, where do these names come from? And apparently the names were the names of the wives of one of the Apollo missions.
Wow, this is wonderful.
Yeah. They would just come up with these historical figures, and hysterical at that matter. And so everything had these unusual names. All of our cars had really unusual names. I won't keep going, but I think you get the idea.
Wow, that is some amazing trivia. That is great. I love it.
What were the names of the 3 bushes outside the Thomas family's back door?
Seriously, yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, I don't know how we're going to get back on track after that, but I'm going to try.
Well, let's try. Really desperately,
Okay.
Let's try.
All right. So Angie, as I said, was an animal lover. She spent her spare money on guinea pigs and bunnies and caring for them. She did ultimately decide, after attending a career day program at her high school, to enroll in the DeVry Institute in New Jersey, which was a 2-year program. She later transferred to the DeVry in Los Angeles, where she ultimately graduated with honors, after which she took a job in Phoenix with Scintellect, which was an electronics company. And at the time of her murder, she was living in a North Phoenix apartment at the I-17 and Cactus Road with her boyfriend.
She sounds like a delightful person, by the way. In all seriousness, I know we're talking about the bunnies and the guinea pigs, but she just sounds like an amazing, wonderful, positive person. I love the description from her family about her lighting up the room, and that she would change the room by coming into it because she was so full of life and energy and enthusiasm. She just sounds like a lovely person.
And the photos that have been posted of her, she has got the best smile. It's just an absolutely enormous smile, and it's a very real smile as well. Like it's not posed for a photo. Like she does seem like a very happy person.
She does.
So Angela went out for a bike ride on a bike path near her apartment, and it's a bike path that parallels the Arizona Canal. And if the words Arizona and canal seem a little strange to go together, don't be too impressed with the canal. It's just kind of a ditch full of water. I live there. I can call it that.
Okay. But there's a bike path alongside.
There is a bike path alongside of it. Yes, absolutely. So Angie went out for a bike ride on that bike path that paralleled the canal and did not come home from her bike ride, at which point her very concerned boyfriend called the police. Angie's torso was found in a field behind her apartment complex the next day. It was nude and it had been mutilated. The nature of the mutilations I have not found and frankly do not want to.
It's probably enough detail there.
Possibly the worst of all the details is that Angie's head was found 2 miles away, floating in the Arizona Canal in a grate near the Metro Center 11 days later. Absolutely horrific.
Yeah, just awful.
Just horrific. There were no witnesses to her abduction or attack. There were no descriptions of a suspect from the scene. All of her belongings were gone, and that does include her bike that has never been located. No weapons were found at the scene. It was very, very much a mystery as to what had happened to this beautiful young lady who went out for a bike ride and just seemingly was blitz attacked, I assume, and was ultimately murdered in probably the most horrific way that I can imagine.
And so this November 1992 attack was a daytime attack, correct? She's out during the day riding her bike along the canal, and she essentially disappears, and then only later body parts begin to turn up. And the bicycle itself that she was riding is nowhere to be found.
No, nowhere to be found. It was a very inexplicable crime. And one of the retired detectives that worked on the case described it as possibly the most horrific crime scene that he had ever worked, or I would almost say had the misfortune to work.
Yeah. And it's funny when you hear comments like that from law enforcement officers who see a lot, you know it's got to be bad. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that brings it home. Well, 10 months later, after Angela Brasso's death, and, apparently there had been very few leads, no suspects, there was the murder of Melanie Bernas. She was 17, so younger than Angela. And this happened on September 21st of 1993. Melanie, who was a junior at Arcadia High School, was found floating in the Arizona Canal near I-17 and Dunlap. So it's actually not terribly far from where Angie had been found. Mm-hmm. Now, Melanie was found intact, thankfully. She had not been decapitated. She also had gone missing while she was out for a bike ride on that same bike path near the canal. So we have our first commonality there, 2 women who had been out for a bike ride on this same area. Melanie's bike was also not recovered. To this day, it has not been recovered, neither has Angela's.
It's very striking.
One of Melanie's belongings was recovered, and that was a turquoise bodysuit, and that was found nearby. But no other belongings were located for Melanie.
There's one thing about this that kind of strikes me as a little bit backwards, which is the women's bodies are found, but the bicycles are not. In other words, why go to the significant effort to take a bicycle, which could have been used, I guess, for transportation, in other words, to get away from the crime scene or what have you, but then the bodies are found. If I were trying to approach this logically, I think it would be more in the killer's interest to hide the bodies rather than the bicycles.
Mm-hmm. And if you think about it, I mean, now granted, I am not a profiler, so I don't have a good understanding of the nature of trophies. But I would think that a mountain bike kept as a trophy, that's a pretty big and significant trophy to keep if the killer has kept it. And like I said, we haven't found the bikes. We don't know whether he kept them or not.
Yeah, it's strange. It's strange, though. It is very odd.
It is. It is very strange. Melanie was very much like Angela, a high flyer, a high achiever. She's beautiful, described as being very, very much a girl next door, and her photos weigh that out. She's just a very blonde and perky and pretty. She was very interested in becoming a doctor, and so she had visits to UC Berkeley and Pepperdine scheduled. And unfortunately, she was murdered before she was able to make those campus visits.
It's funny. It's one of the things that you and I were talking about as we were preparing. These are two extremely intelligent young women who I think are probably going to be savvy enough not to fall for something that a younger victim might have fallen for. Like, sure. Can you help me look for my lost puppy? Or, know, any of those ruses that we've seen perpetrators use in other crimes like this. Somehow, this attacker seems to be able to take control of these women very, very quickly. And I think you mentioned blitz attack. That's almost what this feels like, is that someone is sort of sweeping them off their wheels, if you know what I mean, and stopping them somehow. Because if you're on a bicycle and moving along at a pretty good clip, you could potentially get away from an attacker, but somehow this perpetrator is able to stop these young women out for a bike ride along the path. And as an avid cyclist, bike paths can be kind of lonesome. They usually stretch out. As a matter of fact, one of the bike paths that we used to ride in Southern California ran for several miles along a very similar kind of canal. And you'd see other people walking, rollerblading, and biking on the path, but you might go a mile or two at a time without running into anybody. And you'd also see people hanging out who weren't necessarily there to enjoy the bike path. And, you basically just ignore them and keep riding. For the most part, there was no interaction. This is very striking, the way this perpetrator seems to be using this particular bike trail as a hunting ground.
Yeah, no, exactly. And when we get a little bit more into our suspect, we'll discuss his familiarity with the bike paths as well. Now, DNA was found at both crime scenes. We do not know the nature of the DNA. We don't know if it was skin, hair. We have no idea. That has not been revealed. I assume that that's something that will eventually come up in trial. And where that DNA was found also has not been revealed. So again, I assume that's something that will come up during this trial, assuming it does actually happen in June. There was DNA found at both crime scenes. Police did enter that DNA into CODIS, which we'll talk about in just a couple of minutes, but they were unable to obtain a hit on that DNA. They were able to link the cases together, but they were unable to link it to a suspect. The investigators had pretty much reached the end of the road. The cases went cold. Not for a lack of trying on their part. There was simply no further investigatory avenue that they could go down.
And here the passage of time actually begins to help us in this example.
Yes, for sure. For sure. Now, the Phoenix PD, they did not let the cases go. They really did try their hardest to try to solve them, and they would put out updates every couple of years, signs along the bike path, just reminding people these are cases that we are still looking into. These were not relegated to the unsolved stack on someone's desk. But it went years where there were no answers for either of these two murders. And so after several years with no answers and police still investigating leads, Phoenix PD finally took a very interesting step, and they presented their case to the Vidocq Society. For anybody who's unaware, the Vidocq Society is an organization of former law enforcement officers, profilers, forensic experts, the real top people in their field who are willing to lend their time and their expertise into solving cold cases, which I think is fascinating and fabulous and wonderful of them to do.
Now, the Vidocq Society meets the third Thursday of every month for a lengthy lunch in Philadelphia, where the organization is based. In the Small World department, I had hoped some years back, about 10 years ago or so, I had tried to present the Colonial Parkway murders to the Vidocq Society. But unfortunately, they will only review a case if they can have full access to the files. And that means that they must have the cooperation of the law enforcement agency or agencies responsible for a particular investigation. So kudos to the Phoenix Police Department for being willing to try something a little different, a little unusual. And typically an investigator or investigators will make the trip to Philadelphia and present the case and answer questions. And they really, as we understand it, probe the investigators with a lot of questions. You're talking about, a lot of very smart people, a lot of investigative horsepower in that room from all of these folks from various backgrounds. And as a matter of fact, Jim Fitzgerald is a member.
Yes, he is. Yes, he is. We are so psyched to know that. And we did ask Fitz if he was familiar with this case. And because he has spent so much time on so many cases, he didn't recall it specifically. But when I gave him some case details, he was very interested in hearing the outcome of this. So,
am I mistaken in that Fitz has offered to take you to one of these meetings?
He has offered. I'm not sure if we're supposed to say that on the air, so we may need to cut that.
While we're leaving it in for the moment, I'm seething with jealousy at this moment. Talk about something very exclusive and pretty cool with lots of amazing people, and I think there'd be a lot to be learned from. So
I would love it. Yeah, it's going to be great.
Phoenix presented this case to the Vidocq Society. By the way, Vidocq is a real man. He's a French criminal who is considered to be sort of the father of contemporary criminology because he was a criminal who then transitioned over to the side of goodness and light. And he assisted law enforcement in solving cases and helped them structure French police departments into looking into cold case murders and other cases. And he's also considered to be effectively the first private investigator.
So very, very aptly named.
Yeah, the spelling is a little unusual too. You have to think French here. Vidocq, the Vidocq Society.
Very, very cool, though. And there actually have been a couple of very interesting books written about the Vidocq Society. So if you are still looking for quarantine reading, do check out what has been written on Vidocq. There's some pretty interesting information to be had.
Yeah, there's one I have on my bookshelf here called The Murder Room, which is really good.
Yes, that one was wonderful.
Yeah.
Is it any surprise to you that I've read it?
Folks, if you haven't figured this out, if you mention a true crime book, Kristin Dilley has read it and probably met the author and probably has his or her autograph.
No, not necessarily. I wouldn't take it that far, but yes, I have read a lot. So the Vidocq Society did put together a profile for Phoenix PD. And although we don't have that whole profile because, that information has not been released, they did say a couple of things that did help Phoenix move their way forward with the case. They stated that the offender very likely still lived nearby and hadn't taken off for parts unknown. They did say that the police may have encountered this individual early in their investigation. We do know that suspects like to inject themselves into investigations at times. So they felt that this is someone the police may have encountered earlier. They did say that this person would likely have engaged in what they called precursor crimes, like setting fires or acting out violent fantasies.
Very interesting because as the story unfolds, it turns out that this group of experts were pretty spot on.
Pretty spot on, exactly. So Phoenix PD went back to their case files and began combing through with this new information from the Vidocq Society intact. And they came upon the name Brian Patrick Miller. And when they looked a little further into Miller, their antenna went up for a couple of reasons. And the first one made my antenna go up too. Brian Patrick Miller had been arrested at 16 for the 1990 stabbing, not murder, but stabbing, of a woman near the Paradise Valley Mall. And if this doesn't send shivers up your spine, I don't know what will. Miller stated that he stabbed this woman, who apparently was completely unknown to him, because she looked like his mother.
Kind of creepy.
Yeah, a little bit. He said that stabbing her had sent shivers up his spine. So as a result of this stabbing, again, this was not fatal. This was just grabbing somebody and stabbing them. I can't imagine what would make someone do that, but here we are. He was sent to a juvenile correctional facility where he served 2 years until he turned 18. And now we're going to get into the realm that I know Bill probably wants to touch on a little bit, and that's the fact that even after this quite heinous crime for a 16-year-old, Brian Patrick Miller's DNA had not been entered into CODIS, and that is largely how he avoided detection for so many years.
Now, my guess is that Miller's DNA was not put into the CODIS system because he was a minor at the time of this stabbing. One of the things as we walk you through the case, and Kristin's done some incredible research here, you start to see a pattern of missed opportunities with this particular suspect. Again, he hasn't been found guilty of anything, certainly of these murders that he's been charged with. You start to see time after time where, in my opinion, Miller's DNA should have been placed into the FBI CODIS system. Just a reminder, that's the DNA database system, which is shared by the various states around the country, and the FBI does the overall administration of it. In coming weeks, we're going to be exploring more about the deficiencies of the CODIS system. I know our guest, David Middleman, recently discussed some of the limitations of the CODIS system and the fact that this was set up with what was state-of-the-art technology in the 1990s. We're hoping that in the future, some other guests will be able to tell us other problem areas with CODIS. CODIS is far from perfect, and it is a database with a significant number of problems. One of the key things that you're going to start to see in this Canal Murders case is that this suspect's DNA, which in my opinion should have been placed into CODIS at several different points, was not placed into the CODIS system. So the expression, garbage in, garbage out, without suspects' DNA being placed into these databases, they are essentially worthless.
In terms of Brian Patrick Miller, the Phoenix PD's radar was, attuned to him, and learning that he had been sent to a juvenile correctional facility for stabbing someone in 1990, certainly, that sent up a red flag. Now, they also got a red flag about Miller because at some point, and when she made this call is unclear, his mother actually called Phoenix PD and reported that her son, Brian Patrick Miller, had what she called a strange obsession with the Angela Brasso case. And she said it was an obsession that had stretched on for years.
I found this very striking.
Yes, so did I. And again, there is a lot of information that we don't know here. Mm-hmm. We don't know what strange obsession looks like. Maybe he talked about it a lot. Maybe he was interested in the newspaper reporting on it. We don't know. But it is interesting that his mother was concerned enough about this strange obsession that she felt she needed to call Phoenix PD and say, hey, I don't know, you maybe want to look at my son.
Yeah, it does sound like that's what she was saying.
According to Phoenix police, Brian Patrick Miller actually had been interviewed at one point after both of the murders occurred. Again, we don't know why they felt that that was important to interview him, but sometime in 1992 or 1993, after both murders had happened, Phoenix PD did have their eye on him. They did interview him. According to Phoenix PD, there was no physical evidence that tied him to the scene, so they had to cut him loose. And at that point, Brian Patrick Miller left Phoenix in 1993 and moved to Everett, Washington.
I have to give the Phoenix Police Department credit again here, too, because any case like this that stretches on for decades as an unsolved is frustrating, and there are likely missed opportunities. I do have to give the Phoenix Police Department credit for doing what sounds like a pretty complete investigation. They didn't miss this guy. And it's interesting that the Vidocq Society experts said it's likely you would have encountered this potential perpetrator, earlier on in the investigation, which is exactly what had happened. The Phoenix Police Department didn't have any evidence at that point where they could charge this guy. He would probably be among dozens or more of suspects that they probably looked at the time.
We do know that Brian Patrick Miller left Phoenix and moved to Everett, Washington. And there are two particular items of interest that happened in Everett, Washington during the time that Brian Patrick Miller was there that we're going to get into a little bit later. But I want to keep the timeline going up until the point at which an arrest was made. So we'll go ahead and keep going here and stick a pin in Everett, Washington, but we will come back to it.
Sounds good.
In October of 2014, our good friend Colleen Fitzpatrick, I'm going to get you to introduce her in a second here, Bill, attended what was called a Human Identification Conference in Phoenix. At that conference, there were also investigators from the Phoenix Police Department. And when they met Colleen Fitzpatrick, they were very interested in what she had to say about DNA and its use in identifying suspects. Now, for this next part, I'm actually going to quote from the Arizona Republic because they can say it a whole lot better than I can. Quote, Phoenix investigators attended the conference too and learned about the potential to glean an unknown person's surname by analyzing a DNA profile's paternal lineage through the Y chromosome.
That's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful. Now, Bill, you know Colleen, and I know that you're interested in some of this. Can you put that into perspective?
I'll try. Okay.
For the rest of us?
Well, first of all, Colleen Fitzpatrick is a world-renowned forensic genealogist. She is among a handful of amazing women, interestingly, who have been the greatest innovators in this forensic genealogy or investigative genetic genealogy space. Colleen Fitzpatrick, who's also literally a rocket scientist who became interested in forensic genealogy and in genealogy in general while researching her own family, is one of the people who's credited with moving this new area of science forward. What Colleen was telling the police officers whom she met was that there was potential. This is well before the Golden State Killer case, where Barbara Ray Venter and her team had moved that case forward. This conversation centered around Colleen and others' research that it might be possible to determine an unknown person's lineage through DNA evidence that would allow you to track through the Y chromosome, which is on the father's side. And although Colleen is going to be our special guest in an upcoming episode of Mind Over Murder, and we're really excited about this, and she will talk about this case within the limits of what she can talk about. There are some things that she cannot talk about. For example, her specific software-based method for doing some of this research. Until this case moves all the way forward through the legal system, she can't get into all of the details. But she told the Phoenix investigators that there was potential to investigate someone using a genealogical database like GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA, or with some success, would likely be able to provide the surname, keeping in mind that in most Western countries, your last name is passed down from your father. So she thought there was a possibility with DNA evidence that she might be able to research and identify an individual, or at minimum, their last name.
And she did. She was able to do this successfully, because I don't want to step on her toes when she comes in and speaks to us. I'm not going to go terribly much into it. I am just going to go ahead and say that she was able, through all of her research, to flag that surname of Miller. She used a genealogy database to check whether there were any Millers living in an apartment complex during that time period near the Arizona Canal. And that did take investigators right back around to Brian Patrick Miller. And at that point, I would imagine probably they were fairly confident at this point that they needed to take a good hard look at this guy. In January of 2015, Brian Patrick Miller was put under surveillance by Phoenix PD, and his DNA was obtained surreptitiously, you can probably hear me making air quotes, using a discarded item. So I'm imagining that's going to be a piece of trash, a water bottle, cigarette, something along those lines, that he used and then was threw away as trash.
Similar to the technique used in the Golden State Killer and other examples. There have been over 100 now examples in the last 2 years of law enforcement using this technique. Once they'd identified a potential perpetrator, then going out and collecting a discarded item. And if you throw away a cigarette butt or a soda bottle or whatever, you're leaving your DNA behind everywhere you go. It has gone through the court system. They do have the right to collect your trash, if you will, and obtain your DNA to determine whether or not that might match a DNA profile of a potential perpetrator.
And really at that point, it was point, set, and match for Phoenix PD. Miller's DNA did match the DNA profile found on both victims, and that resulted in the arrest of Brian Patrick Miller on January the 13th, 2015. As we said at the top of the pod, he is still awaiting trial. And if it seems like 5 years is a really long time to wait for trial, people who've been following the case have definitely remarked, when is this guy going to trial? Oh my God.
All those cliches about the wheels of justice turning slowly, but they do turn, may apply here. Keeping in mind that, we're talking about cases that stretch back to the early 90s. And here we are in January 2015, finally seeing an arrest.
Now, and this is a death penalty case. The prosecutors did seek the death penalty, and I imagine that may be some of the reason why things are moving so slowly. I don't know. I'm not a prosecutor, but I would imagine that you maybe need to take a little bit of extra time with cases in which the death penalty is on the table. Maybe that's why it's taking so long. There were some continuances in the trial. So it had originally been set to start in 2019, but it has been moved to June of this year, and we'll see what happens with that.
Now, amazingly, Miller denies involvement in the murder of these two young women, but he cannot seem to explain how his DNA could have been found in connection with these two victims. It's a big, it's a big shrug of the shoulders. What can we say?
Police did go to search Miller's home. There were some unsealed search warrants that were given out to the press because this has been a big case for Phoenix, and people are very interested in learning more about it and more about the man who, I believe one newspaper report described it as haunted the valley for 20 years. So a number of people have been very interested in this case. So at some point or another, items about this arrest have been released out to the press. So some of the unsealed search warrants show that more than 400 items of evidence were seized from Brian Patrick Miller's home, where he did live with his teenage daughter. Her name is Sarah. Interestingly enough, police described the house as that of what they called a classic hoarder, with items stacked from floor to ceiling. A lot of things that they pulled out of the house. The items that they seized included clothing, computers, flash drives, hard drives, DVDs, comic books, jewelry and hair clips, which I found interesting.
Yeah.
It is alleged, this has not been confirmed by anyone, allegedly a rusty bike was removed from the house.
Interesting.
Yeah, that has not been officially confirmed. There are some pictures, but again, we have no way of knowing who that bike belongs to. Could be his, could be his daughter's, could be anybody's.
Right. But Melanie and Angie's bikes have never been recovered. So it's an interesting possibility.
Now, police also searched his car and his personal locker at his place of employment, which to my understanding is an Amazon distribution center on Buckeye.
I don't want to say anything bad about Amazon here. Oh boy.
Let's get a little bit into Brian Patrick Miller here, and I have no problem saying that this guy, he gives me the willies, the heebie-jeebies, whatever you want to call it. He freaks me out.
He's a creepster. There's no question about it. When you start reading about the guy, the more you read about him, the creepier he seems. Yeah.
And it's, I hate to speak ill of anybody, but if this guy, I'm sorry, he's just a total creep show, and it just, yeah.
Oh, go right ahead. Again, a reminder to ourselves, he has not been convicted of these crimes, but he is a creep. There's no question about that.
Yeah. So we'll just go ahead and get into sort of personality profile, if you will, of Brian Patrick Miller. And this is all according to people who knew him or according to his social pages. So when asked about her tenant, his landlord, Agnes Reynolds, described him as not being a good tenant at all. She said he very rarely paid his rent on time or in full. He did ask if he can supplement his rent by cutting lawns on her properties, but he very rarely did that. She said that the only reason she did not actually kick him out of his house for non-payment is because she was very fond of his daughter, and she didn't want his daughter to be lacking a home. Other renters in the neighborhood described him as shy, and we also heard the term quiet used as related to him, but others described him as not quite normal.
I love that. I hope my neighbors wouldn't describe me as not quite normal.
And again, that could be used to describe any number of things, but it does seem that part of that moniker of not quite normal came from Miller's affinity for cosplaying as a character called the Zombie Hunter.
And here's where you explain what cosplay is, right?
Okay, yes. All right. So for anybody who's not aware of what cosplay is a short form of costume play. And that is where you dress up as a character. Generally, it's like, if we're talking in terms of something like Comic-Con, it's a well-known character. You dress up as a stormtrooper or a Marvel superhero or someone from Star Trek or Star Wars. Don't ask me if I've done it. Bill was threatening earlier. Cosplay is simply, it's costume play. It's dressing up as a character.
This is by adults now, is it not, Kristin?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so that's interesting.
Can anybody else hear Bill being judgmental? Because I can hear Bill being judgmental.
There's no judgmental. There might have been a tad of cynicism attached. That didn't sound judgmental now, did it?
It must have been the conversation we had earlier.
Well, yes.
It's okay. No, I can understand where this might seem a little, I can understand where it might seem a little odd. I definitely can.
For kids age 2 to 12, probably not that odd. Our son Chris loved dressing up as various superheroes. And lots of boys and girls I know, emphasis on boys and girls, love to dress up as their favorite stormtrooper / superhero.
Well, cosplay is something that probably more adults than you would think do engage in.
Uh-huh. Oh, interesting. So these are grown-ups now. These are adults.
Yes. I do have some friends who cosplay on the regular, which is why I'm trying to be very...
Cosplay and regular used in the same sentence. That's interesting.
Okay.
Let the record show that Ms. Dilley is rolling her eyes.
All right. Well, we're just going to go ahead and dig a little bit into what Brian Patrick Miller was doing as the zombie hunter.
Let's dig a little deeper, shall we?
Yes. Okay. So Miller had a character that he played, and the name of that character was the Zombie Hunter, which has led to some people substituting the nickname the Canal Killer for the Zombie Hunter. Brian Patrick Miller marketed himself as that character, the character known as the Zombie Hunter. He marketed himself on Facebook and on other social media platforms as the Zombie Hunter. He made appearances at comic book stores and zombie walks as this character.
Wait, let's stop for a second. What's a zombie walk?
I imagine probably it's like a Halloween type event.
With zombies?
Yeah, I imagine so.
Real zombies or cosplaying zombies?
Cosplaying zombies.
Cosplaying zombies.
Pretty sure.
Okay.
I don't think there's real zombies.
Okay. I was just checking. I didn't want to blow past zombie walks without asking exactly what a zombie walk was, because I'm here to learn.
It may be something that they do in Phoenix. I don't remember attending one, but I'm also not the most social person in the entire world or most of the world, so I just may not be familiar with it.
If you had been invited to a zombie walk, I'm sure you would have gone.
Actually, probably not. I'm very, very introverted.
Not that introverted.
All right. So as the Zombie Hunter, Brian Patrick Miller drove a black and white Crown Vic. It was a decommissioned police cruiser. Now, it had the light bar, but it also, rather disturbingly, had bloody handprints and drag marks on the sides and the hood and the roof of the car. And it featured a bumper sticker on the trunk that said Zombie Hunter, which is where the nickname came from.
Let the record show that I'm now rolling my eyes.
Okay. The record shall so reflect. Now, how involved this cosplay was, I have no idea. We haven't found a lot of information about it. We do know, according to some of the reporting that was done by AZ Central, that he did have friends that he role-played with or cosplayed with, and I'm sorry if I'm using the wrong term. And we do know that there was an area outside of Tempe near the Superstition Mountains that he went to with friends to role play. We do know that. But the full extent of it, we don't really know. We don't have a good grasp on at this point. We do know, based on his social media accounts, particularly his Facebook page, that he was quite fond of fantasy genre, especially steampunk. He had a great interest in San Diego Comic-Con. Not really, that's not surprising. He did have an affinity for artwork, original artwork. He did follow the DeviantArt website. And the artwork that he tended to gravitate toward and tended to like the most was the sort of artwork that depicted mutilated women or horribly murdered and horribly disfigured women. So he left a trail on the DeviantArt page of likes of all of this subject matter. You know, this is a guy who, at least based on his social media, did seem to have a preference for the gorier types of artwork associated with his interests and hobbies.
On that upbeat note, I think we need to close out this episode of Mind Over Murder. Join us next time when we continue our exploration of the suspect, Brian Patrick Miller, and his potential involvement in the Canal Killer case in Phoenix, Arizona.
Thank you so much for listening to Mind Over Murder, and stay tuned for part 2.
Sources used in this week's episode include
reporting from app.com, azcentral.com, Fox 10 Phoenix, Friends and Felonies, the Gunpowder Gazette, and Medium.com.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.